Tonight, trade war.
We may have short-term a little pain, and people understand that.
President Trump's new tariffs on Canada and China kick in today. Reaction in the world markets and what it means for you.
Fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico to maple syrup and vehicles from Canada.
Plus, Trump's first Oval Office visit with a foreign leader.
It's a testimony to the strength of the Israeli-American alliance. It's also a testimony to the strength of our personal friendship.
And ahead of Sunday's Super Bowl, betting it all on the farm. A new film about a rancher.
Sometimes you have to get to that point of brokenness and despair.
And how his love of football renews his faith. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. A major trade showdown with Canada and Mexico hitting back to counter new U.S. tariffs. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Well, this evening, new developments around President Trump's trade policies after an agreement earlier to delay imposing a 25% tariff on all goods from Mexico. Those tariffs were set to go into effect at midnight, along with tariffs against Canada and China. They're still set to happen, causing the stock market to slump. We now turn to the U.S. Capitol, where we find CBN correspondent Michelle London, who's been monitoring the events of the day. Michelle, can you talk about the terms around these negotiations to hold off on imposing those tariffs, specifically on Mexican goods?
Yeah, lots of moving parts, John. As of today, the president says tariffs won't be imposed on Mexico for at least another month, adding that he had a friendly conversation earlier with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who pledged to deploy 10,000 members of the Mexican National Guard to the border to prevent the flow of drugs like fentanyl and illegal immigrants into the U.S. Trump did say the negotiations with Sheinbaum will continue as they attempt to work out a deal between the U.S. and Mexico. However, tariffs of up to 25% for Canada and 10% taxes on China are still set to go into effect come midnight.
So, Michelle, what types of goods can we expect some of these tariffs to hit?
Well, economists are warning a 10% tax in China threatens higher prices on consumer electronics and children's toys. And that's important to note because 85% of all toys in the U.S. are made in China. And with Canada, those 25% tariffs could be imposed on everything from maple syrup and vehicles. New car prices could go up an average $3,000. And then there's the hardest hitters like crude oil, which is where the U.S. gets up to 60% of our imports. And lumber, we get 60% of our lumber from Canada. Now, when it comes to flow of drugs and illegal immigration entering through Canada versus Mexico, Kill Point chief economist Steve Skanke tells me there is no comparison. Last year, he says, about 16,000 pounds of fentanyl was stopped at Mexico's border, while 70 pounds, just 70 pounds was stopped at Canada's checkpoints. Skanke believes Trump wants to remedy Americans from buying more goods from other countries than our own. But if these tariffs continue long term, John, we could see detrimental effects.
If these things go forward, 80% of the goods Canada ships come to the United States. It's 20% of their economy. If these tariffs continue, it quite likely would just put them in a recession.
A word no one wants to hear, recession. Michelle, if these sweeping tariffs do go into effect at midnight in Canada and China and parts of the European Union, how would they affect American families in the long term?
Well, John, Skanke mentioned these tariffs could cost American households on average up to $1,500 extra per year, which could be the opposite of the promises President Trump campaigned on to bring grocery prices down. Take a listen.
And this, as we've been talking about, is going to increase prices and increase inflation, and it's going to be in things that are very visible, like gasoline prices and grocery store prices.
So, Michelle, since you're there at the U.S. Capitol, talk about the reaction on Capitol Hill from lawmakers.
Yeah, today's Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer cautioned the move is now a trade war for the American people, who will now be at war between prices and their paychecks. This move has so far triggered retaliatory tariffs from Canada, and China has said it will challenge the tariffs at the World Trade Organization and take unspecified countermeasures in response. John.
All right, CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Michelle London. Thank you so much, Michelle. Well, with that, let's bring in Richard Stern. He is the director of the Center of the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to you, Richard. So what does this 1 month delay really mean? Is it just a temporary pause, or do you think it could lead to a larger trade negotiation between the United States and Mexico?
Think of it as a down payment on what's going on right now. So Trump announced these tariffs because we're talking about 3 countries that have worked to subvert their trade agreements and our laws. Mexico and Canada in particular, of course, have been allowing Chinese fentanyl to flood into the United States. And so the reason we have the month-long pause is because the Mexican government has basically overnight said they're willing to put troops on the border to help us. They're willing to do other things to help secure the border. And so I would view this 1 month kind of like a ceasefire. They say, we'll see how good you make on your promises, and then we'll see what else you need to do to really make sure you're keeping up your end of the bargain to secure the border.
I like those analogies, a ceasefire or down payment. So Canada, though, has already responded with retaliatory tariffs, and China's threatening countermeasures. Richard, how close are we to a potential full-scale trade war?
Well, it's hard to know, but what I would say is keep in mind about Canada, it's a little bit of a patchwork. So the Premier of Alberta, for example, has been working with the Trump administration, which is among the reasons why energy resources mostly coming out of Alberta are facing a 10% rate and not the 25% rate across all of Canada. And a lot of this is really just that Trudeau is a lame duck prime minister. He is a man with nothing to lose who is acting like a man with nothing to lose. So I think part of what you're going to see here is that other Canadian politicians have already stepped up. And frankly, they might do what they should have done before, which is call an election and get him out of there and get in a leader who really represents the interests of the Canadian people, somebody who will work with Trump.
So conventional wisdom with many economists, they believe that these tariffs will raise prices on everyday goods for Americans. What's your take?
Well, so I think the important thing about this is tariffs are actually complicated in the real world. And so as much as tariffs can be viewed a lot of times as falling on consumers, the actual burden of tariffs differs radically depending on the exact product, all the other market parameters. The truth is, Canada has about a third of their economy wrapped up in exporting to the U.S. An enormous amount of those products can only be exported to the firms they go to the companies in the U.S. that use them. So it'd be hard for them to find other markets, which is to say that Canada is much, much more reliant on that trade than the United States is. And so that means that an enormous amount of the cost would likely be passed on to Canadian workers and businesses and their consumers, much less to the U.S. The U.S. dollar has already strengthened over the last couple of days against the Canadian dollar, which for U.S. consumers offsets part of the value of the tariffs. And that's before any of the tariffs have actually gone into place whatsoever. But I would say the most important part is this isn't really about the economics. This is a negotiating tool to be able to stop the flood of fentanyl, to deal with these other geopolitical issues.
All right, Richard Stern with the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, upheaval at the world's largest humanitarian assistance program. Police tape and officers blocked Democratic lawmakers from entering the Washington headquarters of the U.S. Agency for International Development. They're challenging the agency effectively being shut down by President Trump after being targeted by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency.
This is a constitutional crisis that we are in today. Let's call it what it is. The people get to decide how we defend the United States of America. The people get to decide how their taxpayer money is spent. Elon Musk does not get to decide.
USAID staffers say they tracked 600 employees who reported being locked out of the agency's computer systems overnight. Well, in other news, the president of Panama is promising to end an important development deal with China. After a visit from new Secretary of State Marco Rubio on his first foreign trip, President Jose Raul Mulino said the Belt and Road Initiative will not be renewed and may be ended earlier than planned. President Trump has voiced concerns about China's growing influence in Panama, allowing for the Belt and Road Initiative to deepen its influence in the country through investments, including some $1.3 billion, in addition to the canal itself. Molino says Panama will keep operating the canal, while President Trump complains China is controlling it, adding that he wants it back for the United States. Well, cleanup and recovery is still underway 5 days after a deadly mid-air collision over Washington, D.C. Crews are pulling wreckage from the Potomac as investigators work to figure out a 125-foot altitude discrepancy. The jet's flight recorder shows it was at 325 feet, but control tower data puts the Black Hawk at 200 feet, the maximum allowed altitude. In all, 67 people were killed between the jet and military aircraft, including 3 Army soldiers. Coming up, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's travel to Washington, how the high-stakes visit could shift the Middle East when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington for President Trump's first meeting with a foreign leader since his inauguration. The two are expected to discuss ongoing tensions in the Middle East and a path forward. CBN national security correspondent Caitlin Burke joins us now with more on what's expected. Caitlin, it's going to be a big meeting.
John, this visit is seen as pivotal for Netanyahu and the future of the Middle East. On the agenda, ending the war with Hamas, bringing home the remaining hostages, and a plan for the future of Gaza. During his campaign, President Trump promised to, quote, solve the Middle East. Tuesday's meeting could give us a look into his strategy for making that happen.
I believe that we can strengthen security, broaden the circle of peace, and achieve a remarkable era of peace through strength.
Before leaving for the U.S., Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about some of the issues he expects to discuss with President Trump.
Victory over Hamas, achieving the release of all our hostages, and dealing with the Iranian terror axis and all its components, an axis that threatens the peace of Israel, the Middle East, and the entire world.
Foreign policy expert Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution says Iran's nuclear program will also likely come up, which could include the possibility of military action against the regime.
They're closer now than they ever were before. And 4 years of Trump and 4 years of Biden allowed them to get closer. It's not as if either the hardline approach or the negotiations approach really worked. And so, Trump is going to have to face a brave new world on the Iran question.
Another top item, establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. President Trump has been pushing this since his first term. O'Hanlon tells CBN News it seems unlikely to happen in the immediate future, however, unless Israel is willing to make significant concessions.
Even with a ceasefire, Saudi Arabia will want to see where that ceasefire goes and whether it leads to a two-state existence with the Palestinians and the Israelis each having part of the land now controlled by Israel. And I think, therefore, any near-term recognition by the Saudis of Israel is pretty unlikely.
Trump has also floated relocating Palestinians to neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan. So far, both countries rejecting that idea.
We have a clear vision regarding the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip without this leading to the expulsion of any citizen from his land. We have a clear vision in this regard.
While we're still awaiting further details about tomorrow's meeting, we do know Netanyahu has extended his stay through Saturday so that he can meet with other U.S. officials. John?
All right, CBN National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke, welcome back from maternity. Well, Ben Talablu joins us now for more. He is a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Ben, welcome back to you. So what do you think of the timing of this meeting? What does that suggest to you? And then what are you expecting to see from these two leaders?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. The timing, make no mistake, is important and historic because this is the first foreign visit of a foreign leader to the United States under the second-term Trump administration. And really, there's a lot more than meets the eye here. This is not just about, if you had to ask me, a hostage deal, a potential extension, as some outlets are alleging, of a potential phase one, or talk about securing just the Eastern Mediterranean. This is about setting the pieces in place for a much larger vision that both leaders have for the region. But naturally, there's going to be bumps along the way towards achieving that vision. And one of the major bumps will be the future of Gaza as one talks about that bigger, grander deal that both politicians have hinted at before. And that's kind of an Abraham Accords 2.0 or the American brokered normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So while all eyes are rightly on Gaza amid this previously negotiated three-part ceasefire deal, we have to think bigger picture here. And I'm sure that's what the president and the prime minister will be discussing next tomorrow, I believe.
Along those lines, the visit coincides with Israel and Hamas beginning negotiations for the second phase of a ceasefire hostage deal. What are the biggest challenges the Trump administration faces in keeping this deal working and alive?
Well, the administration is quite proud of the deal under Steve Witkoff, negotiated this three-part framework with the Israelis. But the challenges for the Israelis, at least politically, internally, there's going to be more speed bumps when it comes to one of the military elements of phase two, which is the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And also a kind of a compounding political question will be what to do with all the Palestinian refugees in the area. And make no mistake, both of those two U.S. major allies, the Egyptians on one side and the Jordanians on the other, have already publicly pushed back against some of the Trump commentary in the proposal to temporarily, at least, take some of the Palestinians so that the Gaza Strip could be rebuilt. So there's going to be political and practical speed bumps for phase two, which is why if one believes the allegations and reporting floating around Washington today, that the Israelis may seek a phase one extension.
Speaking of speed bumps, maybe not so much in Gaza, but in other parts of the Middle East, we just heard Caitlin Burke report President Trump has talked about expanding the Abraham Accords to establish ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. How does Trump's push for an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal tie into the ceasefire negotiations?
Well, you know, the Middle East is a kaleidoscopic place. You have all the same facts on the ground, but every time you add something new into the context, it's like spinning a kaleidoscope. All the same pieces align in a fundamentally different way. So the real art of the deal for the Trump administration in term two is how to keep these two most important pieces of the U.S. Kind of order in the region in place, and that's the Saudis and the Israelis. And how you move along from phase one to phase two and phase three matters very much. How you deal with the Palestinian issue deals very much, particularly after October 7, and how you deal what's left with the Iran-backed axis in the region, which is exactly what Prime Minister Netanyahu referred to, as well as, of course, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, the Islamic Republic of Iran, lurking in the shadows.
We will leave it right there. Ben Talblue with FDD, thank you so much for your time and your expertise tonight. Up next, the Packers may be out of the Super Bowl, but they're front and center in a new faith-based film. That story when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. Are you ready? The Kansas City Chiefs and Philadelphia Eagles are gearing up for a highly anticipated Super Bowl rematch this week. The Green Bay Packers won't be on the field Sunday, but they're taking center stage in a new movie. Green and Gold stars Emmy Award winner Craig T. Nelson as a farmer whose faith in God and his football team drives his fight to save legacy and land. CBN's Ephraim Graham has the story.
Craig T. Nelson may still be best known as the star of the hit series Coach.
These kids are going to learn something about life.
And more recently for his role on Young Sheldon.
You must be a friend of my son's.
Or the voice of the animated character, Mr. Incredible.
This is on.
That's fine.
He's now back on the big screen as Buck in Green and Gold.
How would you describe this character? Who is he?
He's a fourth-generation farmer. He's trying to make sense of life in a situation where it looks like there's no way out. He may lose what he's held precious to him. He's trying to find a faith that means something to him that he doesn't even have.
Easy. For him, it wasn't the frozen tundra. It was the Garden of Eden.
Buck is a diehard fan of the Green Bay Packers, so much so, he wages high stakes to save his land and legacy. You could say he bets the farm, literally.
This ain't your land.
Well, when you don't pay your loan, it becomes my land.
He's wounded, and he's in a situation in life that's a crisis. And he's trying to find a way to manufacture some way to make it work.
This is the work of two first-time filmmakers, producer David Lindwall and director Anders Lindwall. It's a story inspired by their real-life grandfather.
So this story, I understand it's personal, so tell me how.
You know, our grandfather was a dairy farmer, and we just always had like a passion for telling stories about that area, and this is really our first opportunity to get a chance to share kind of the beauty of what we grew up around and the beauty of the people up there.
Tell me about the journey as independent filmmakers to get this film completed. I imagine it was a faith walk on many levels.
You know, as independent filmmakers, you don't have the budget to pay and hire out roles. But honestly, it's been it's been such a joy.
And for Craig T. Nelson, the character of Buck was a blessing.
Generational farms are in my family, and I could identify with that. But I think one of the main reasons was his walk, his faith walk, and that sometimes you have to get to that point of brokenness and despair before you realize you need, and when you realize that you're powerless, and you're brought to that point, and that's when you're perhaps more teachable than others.
Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
From coming up, a Groundhog Day weather prediction is in. Next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a world-famous groundhog makes his annual weather report. Crowds headed to Gobbler's Knob in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania Sunday to hear, or actually rather to see, Phil's Groundhog Day prediction. Legend has it, if he sees his shadow, 6 more weeks of winter are on the way. And if he doesn't, an early spring is in store. This year, Phil had a chilling message that the announcer read aloud for the crowd.
So I'm headed back down. There's a shadow up here. Get ready for 6 more weeks of winter this year.
While Phil's call for an early spring last year came true, he's only been right about 35% of the time since 2005. So world famous, but not necessarily reliable. He still gets to keep his job, though. Thanks so much for watching Faith Nation tonight. We hope to see you right back here again tomorrow.